Hi again then guys, and welcome to the 72nd episode of Days Gone By. This is a review series, of course, for the classic cars and some vintage cars also of the Gran Turismo franchise in particular. And this car is a vehicle which we've kind of touched on before, but not specifically to this model. The car is, of course, the Lotus Europa. And the Europa is a car which stands out easily from the classic crowd as far as design goes because of how unique it looks. It has a very oddball shape compared to many other sports cars, even other Lotus sports cars. It has more of a touring kind of look to it rather than something like a much more pure focused sports car, a more traditional one like an Elan, for instance. But as I said, we have discussed the Europa before. But the version that we talked about was the Europa Special, which is of course the, technically speaking, superior model of the two. It's already more powerful, the pricing is fairly similar, and you do have a livery to some degree on the car. You've got the pinstriping, and it's the obvious choice of the two. But the question is, for those who perhaps want to try something different, or maybe you already own the Europa Special, is this car, the S2 version of the Europa, actually worth buying? Because they featured it on the game for a reason. Why did they bother to add this car? And also, more importantly really, why did they bother to make it a premium when we already had a premium special version, and there are so many other cars which you might expect to have premium versions but which still don't? Well, let's break down what it's capable of and see if we can at least have some theories. The engine on this car is relatively small. Lotus cars aren't known for having a huge amount of power. That's not really their calling card. They go for small, compact sports cars with low weight, and as such they don't typically need a huge amount of power to get the job done. They're quick through the corners. Of course, even in motorsport, especially as far as their heritage goes, that was the staple of what made Lotus so competitive. Instead of just going for sheer power, they would focus more on lowering the weight and increasing the maneuverability of the car, and that pays off in the racing world very well, and potentially it can on road cars also, if the car handles well, because just being small and lightweight doesn't necessarily guarantee that. Now the Europa, I'm not going to sugarcoat it, is not the most beginner friendly of classics. The handling is a little bit twitchy, a little bit feathery, especially when you tune it to its higher potential. And speaking of that potential, that 1.5 litre engine, which is mid-mounted in this car, it drives the rear wheels, and it can be turbocharged, and it puts out a pretty decent 273 horsepower and just under 200 pound-feet of torque. Now that on its own doesn't necessarily sound that remarkable. Even the Europa Special doesn't have insane numbers. But what makes this car so good, and this does carry over to the special version also, is how light it is. As I said earlier, that's a hallmark of Lotus cars, but sometimes they're even lighter than you might expect them to be. This one maybe looks like perhaps a 650 kilo, maybe a 700 kilo car, whereas in actual fact, with the full weight loss package in fully tuned form, it only weighs 552 kilos. That is extremely impressive. Not only is that one of the lightest sports cars in the game, but it's one of the lightest cars in the game, period. That's lighter than all of the Le Mans prototypes. It's lighter than most, in fact, of the other race cars in the game. It's roughly the same kind of weight as the Formula Gran Turismo. That's pretty impressive. It's also a similar kind of weight to Ayrton Senna's Lotus, the 97T. Now obviously, you're not putting out anywhere near the kind of power that those cars would have. However, the fact that the weight is so low, not all that much more than half a tonne in fact, means that the horsepower per tonne is really impressive on this car, in particular in fully tuned form, because that 273 horsepower, combined with 552 kilos, gives you a horsepower per tonne figure of just under 500. That is seriously impressive, and of course in real life not many Europas would be putting out that number because people wouldn't tune them this far, but on the game that is a really healthy number to be working with. In fact, that can rival a number of exotics which are way higher than this car in terms of the respect that they get, the performance that they're considered to have, stuff like high-end Ferraris. In fact, that's not even far off the horsepower per tonne of a Veyron. That's pretty impressive for a little 30,000 credit Lotus. Now, is this the quicker of the two? Is it the slower? Well, yeah, it's the slower. It's the slower to begin with. Even when tuned, it's the slower, so that's not really going to surprise anyone. But I will personally say that I do prefer this one. I like the look of this car more than the Special. I prefer the simpler, smoother, cleaner style that it has without the pinstriping, with the simpler look on the body. I think it's a really nice looking little car. But, as I said earlier, it's not the most beginner friendly of classic sports cars. So why do I say that? Well, put simply, it's because of all the things that make it good. Because there's a certain point when it comes to having low weight and a small physical size when it comes to performance cars that goes from being better and better to passing a certain tipping point where the weight is so low and the car is so small for the performance that it has that you actually need to become more of a skilled driver to get the best out of it. Because if you take a big heavy car and lower the weight more and more and more, then as you'd expect it gets better and better. But once you get to that certain tipping point, the car can actually become just as difficult for a newer driver to handle than if it were huge and heavy. It's kind of a funny, not quite paradox, but a funny situation which can occur with a lot of small sports cars, that even without a huge amount of power, being so small, being so light, and especially if they have a short wheelbase, something like a Chaparral 2J for instance, without the fan system, that can make them very difficult to drive because the handling is so pin sharp that it responds to everything you do. And that is definitely the case with the Europa. It requires very careful setup of the diff and suspension, but when you get it right, for 30 grand, it's a great little track car. Is it the best? Well, at 563 pp, no, definitely not. That's very high, but it is worth consideration. So, that's it for this particular pick. I'll see you guys next time, and as always, thanks for watching.